Maria, a black woman, is wrongfully detained by a racist cop. With her rights denied and fear rising, her lawyer husband David races to her side. In a tense showdown, can David use his legal knowledge to fight back? One moment will change their lives forever. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring and thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us share impactful stories that matter. Now let's get started. It was a typical evening in the city. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the streets. The bustling noise of the city seemed louder at this hour, cars honking, people chatting, and footsteps echoing as people hurried to their destinations. Maria walked briskly along the sidewalk, her worn-out shoes tapping rhythmically against the concrete. She had just finished another long day at work, her mind already drifting toward the comfort of home and the warmth of her husband, David. Despite her exhaustion, Maria's posture remained confident, her shoulders straight, head held high. At 28, she had already built a life for herself, one full of dreams and ambitions. But it hadn't come easy. She had fought hard for every inch of success. As she passed a few familiar faces on the sidewalk, Maria smiled politely, always friendly, always kind. People often remarked about how she was different from the others, how she had a certain aura that made her stand out. But for Maria, standing out wasn't always a blessing. Being a black woman in a predominantly white neighborhood meant facing subtle looks, whispers, and sometimes blatant discrimination. She had learned to navigate those situations with grace, always determined to rise above it. Her dreams were too big to let those small things hold her back. At that moment, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, seeing David's name on the screen. She smiled softly, her heart lifting at the thought of him. "Hey, love," she answered. "Hey, how's the day going?" David's voice was warm, comforting, even over the phone. "Same old, you know. Long day, but I'm on my way home. Can't wait to see you." David chuckled on the other end. "I know the feeling. I'm just wrapping up here. I'll be home in about an hour. We can finally relax." Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her. David, her rock, her partner through everything. He had been there for her through thick and thin, supporting her dreams, lifting her up when she faced challenges, and reminding her that no matter what, she wasn't alone. He was a lawyer, smart, sharp, and passionate about justice. Sometimes, Maria joked that he could argue his way out of anything, and he always laughed. But tonight, she didn't know that the world would soon give them a test they hadn't seen coming. As Maria continued walking, the evening air started to cool, and she adjusted her jacket. The city's energy seemed to buzz around her, and yet, something about the way the street felt that night made her uneasy. She shook the feeling off. It was just the long day getting to her. Unknowingly, as she crossed the street at a crosswalk, she caught the attention of someone who had been watching her for a while. A police car, parked at the corner of the street, had its lights off, but the officer inside had been eyeing Maria since she entered the crosswalk. His gaze felt too intense, too focused. For a moment, Maria wondered if it was just her imagination, but then she heard the unmistakable sound of the car door opening. Before she could process it, the officer was approaching her, a stern look on his face. Maria slowed her pace, confusion washing over her. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was simply walking home. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer called out, his voice sharp. Maria stopped in her tracks, unsure of what was happening. The officer was tall, with a cold expression, and his uniform seemed too stiff for the casual setting. There was something about him that felt off. He didn't seem like he was here to help. "Can I ask what you're doing out here?" The officer's voice was rigid. Maria blinked, trying to understand. "I'm just walking home from work, officer." The officer's eyes narrowed. "It's late. You're walking alone in this part of town?" "Doesn't seem right." Maria's stomach sank, the unease she had felt earlier now intensifying. She kept her voice calm. "I'm fine, officer. I've been walking this route for months." But the officer didn't seem to hear her. Instead, he stepped closer, a little too close. "I need to see some ID." Maria took a step back. "There's no need for that. I'm just heading home." The officer's face hardened. "I'm asking for your ID, now." Maria's pulse quickened, and a knot formed in her stomach. She didn't understand what was happening, why this was happening. There was no reason for her to be stopped, no reason for this hostility. She felt vulnerable, exposed. The bright city lights that usually comforted her now felt harsh, too bright, as if they were highlighting her every move. Maria's heart raced as the officer stepped closer, the weight of the situation suddenly becoming all too real. She had been stopped countless times before, but never like this. Not by an officer so aggressive, so determined to find fault. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what had gone wrong, what she had done to deserve this. She glanced around, hoping someone would step in, but the sidewalk was empty. The evening was turning darker, and the usual rush of people had slowed. It was just her and this officer, locked in an unwanted confrontation on a quiet street. "Your ID now," the officer repeated, his voice a sharp command that made Maria's chest tighten. His hand rested on his holster, as though ready to make a move at any moment. The sudden aggression felt like an unjustified attack, and she tried to swallow the lump in her throat. "I told you, officer," Maria said calmly, but her voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. "I'm just walking home from work. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer stared at her, his eyes cold and unblinking, almost as if he were looking through her. There was something unsettling in his gaze, something predatory. She could feel it, but she didn't understand why he was treating her this way. She had done nothing but walk down the street like any other person. Was it the hour? Was it because she was black? She couldn't help but wonder if this was about something more than just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. "You're out here at this hour alone in a neighborhood like this?" the officer sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. His tone was accusatory, mocking almost. "You don't belong here. You're looking suspicious." Maria froze. The words hit her harder than she expected, sharper than any physical blow. "Suspicious?" she repeated softly, trying to understand. She hadn't been doing anything wrong. She wasn't acting out of place. She was simply walking, just like everyone else in the city. "Yeah, suspicious," the officer replied, a smirk curling his lips. "You really think I'm going to believe that? You're out here dressed like that, walking alone. Tell me, what are you really up to?" Maria's throat felt dry and her fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to keep calm, to stay in control, but the officer's words stung. She had heard these kinds of things before. She had lived them. It was always the same. The subtle glances, the whispers, the feeling that she wasn't welcome, that her presence in a space wasn't natural. "No, officer," Maria said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "I'm just walking home from work. I don't know why you're accusing me of anything." The officer ignored her. "I'm not going to ask you again. Show me your ID." Maria's hands trembled as she reached into her bag, but she hesitated. She knew the rules. She had every right to walk down the street, to be where she was. But somehow she still felt like she had to prove it to him. She had to prove that she belonged, that she wasn't a threat, that she was just a woman trying to get home. She pulled out her ID and held it out toward the officer. The officer took it from her hand with a harsh grip, scanning it for a moment before looking back at her with a critical eye. His expression had not softened. In fact, it seemed to harden even more. "Maria," he said slowly, as if savoring the moment. "You don't look like you belong here. People like you don't walk around in this neighborhood." Maria's blood ran cold at his words. It was like a slap to the face, A reminder that no matter how far she'd come, no matter how hard she worked or how much she tried to fit in, people like him would always see her differently. People like him would always find a reason to treat her as less than. "People like me?" Maria echoed, her voice shaky but rising. "What do you mean by that?" The officer's jaw tightened, and for a moment Maria thought she saw something flash in his eyes, something ugly, something fueled by the kind of prejudice that couldn't be hidden behind a uniform. He stepped closer, his stance becoming more threatening. "I mean exactly what I said," the officer growled. "You think you're special, don't you? You think you can just walk around like this, like you own the place?" He paused, his words growing sharper, more venomous. "You're out here causing trouble, and I'm not going to let it slide. You don't belong here, and you sure as hell don't get to walk away from me." Maria's heart hammered in her chest. The air between them was thick with tension, and it felt like it was about to snap. She tried to stay calm, tried to focus on the simple fact that she hadn't done anything wrong, but the officer's words were becoming harder to ignore. "Listen," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm not causing any trouble. I just want to go home. I'm not a criminal. I've done nothing wrong." But the officer wasn't listening anymore. His face was reddening, his hands twitching by his belt. "You think I care about your excuses?" he spat. "I'm done talking. You've got two choices. Give me your ID or I'll arrest you for obstructing justice." Maria felt a rush of heat flood her face, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. Arrest her? For walking home? For being black? Was this really happening? "I haven't done anything wrong," Maria protested, stepping back slightly. The officer's aggression was overwhelming, suffocating. She could feel his hostility, feel the injustice of the situation crashing down on her like a wave. The officer didn't care. His hand moved to his radio, his voice now dangerously low. "You better get ready. You've made your choice." Maria's mind raced, panic beginning to settle in her chest. She had seen the news, heard the stories. A simple encounter like this could turn into something much worse. She wasn't just a woman being stopped on the street. She was a black woman, and this officer had already made up his mind about her. She needed to stay calm, to think. She couldn't afford to make this worse. But how much longer could she hold on before the situation spiraled completely out of control? Just then, her phone buzzed in her pocket. The sound cut through the tension like a knife, and Maria's heart skipped. It was David. She reached for it, her fingers trembling, but the officer snapped his head toward her. "Don't you dare reach for that phone!" he barked, his hand now hovering dangerously close to his weapon. Maria froze. The coldness in his voice, the way he said it, everything in her screamed to just stay still, stay calm, don't provoke him. But in that moment, a surge of frustration and helplessness flooded her chest. All she had wanted was to walk home. Now she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape from. The officer's hand was still on his holster. The air felt thick, too thick to breathe. Maria's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone. Her fingers trembled with fear, the cold, hard weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. She had to call David. He would know what to do. He always knew what to do. The officer was still standing too close, his hand hovering over his holster, his eyes locked onto her like a predator sizing up its prey. He hadn't moved, hadn't relaxed. His posture was rigid, and his face was a mask of thinly veiled hostility. "Don't even think about it," the officer growled as Maria reached for her phone. His voice was sharp, cutting through the air between them like a blade. He stepped even closer, invading her personal space in a way that felt threatening, suffocating. His breath smelled of stale coffee and cheap cologne, and it made her stomach turn. Maria hesitated for a moment, but the feeling of helplessness overwhelmed her. She had no other choice. She had to get David here. Ignoring the officer's command, Maria's fingers found the screen of her phone, her breath quickening. She pressed David's name on her contact list with shaking hands, praying he would pick up. The seconds felt like hours as the phone rang, each tone a piercing reminder of how badly she needed him right now. She didn't know how much longer she could keep her calm under the officer's unyielding glare. "Come on. Come on," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the officer's heavy breathing. Her palms were slick with sweat. Her heart hammered in her chest as the phone continued to ring. Finally, on the fourth ring, David's voice came through, crisp and clear. "Maria? What's wrong?" His voice was calm, but she could hear the concern in it, the quiet urgency that always followed when something was wrong. "David," Maria gasped, her voice shaky with panic. I'm being stopped by a cop. I don't know what's going on, but he's threatening me, David. He's acting like I did something wrong. Please hurry, please." She could barely get the words out, her breath coming in short bursts as fear started to grip her. The officer's presence felt suffocating, and she could already feel her knees beginning to weaken under the weight of the tension. "Stay calm, Maria. Stay calm. I'm on my way. Just don't let him do anything. You're not alone. I'm coming right now," David reassured her, his voice steady despite the urgency in her words. Maria nodded, though she knew he couldn't see it. "Please hurry, David," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know what he's going to do. He's really angry." "I'm on it. Just breathe. I'm almost there." David's voice was firm, unwavering. It was the only thing that kept her grounded in that moment. He would be there. He always came through. As she ended the call, Maria felt a small measure of relief, but it quickly evaporated as the officer stepped even closer. His eyes were narrowed, and his jaw was clenched tightly. "You made a mistake," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You should have listened. Now, you're going to pay for your disrespect." Maria flinched. The words hit her like a slap. She had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. And yet, here she was, trapped in a confrontation with a man who seemed determined to escalate the situation for no reason other than his own prejudices. "I'm not disrespecting anyone," she said, her voice trembling but laced with defiance. "I just want to go home. You have no reason to stop me. I haven't done anything." The officer's face twisted into a sneer. "You don't get to talk back to me, woman. You're the one causing trouble, not me. You think you can just walk around looking like you belong? This neighborhood doesn't work like that." Maria's breath caught in her throat. It was clear now. This wasn't about her actions. This wasn't about anything she had done. This was about who she was, the color of her skin, the way she looked, the way he thought she didn't belong in a place like this. But she refused to let him see her fear. She stood tall, squared her shoulders, and met his eyes. "I don't care what you think. I have every right to be here." The officer took a step forward, now so close that she could feel the heat of his body. "You think you can just talk your way out of this? You think you're above the law?" His voice was a low growl, each word dripping with contempt. Maria's pulse was thumping in her ears and her mind raced. She had to stay calm. She had to think. She couldn't let him provoke her any further. She couldn't let the situation escalate into something worse. The officer's hand moved to his radio, and for a moment, Maria's stomach dropped. She had seen the news. She had heard the stories. A simple interaction could turn violent, could spiral out of control in an instant. Her eyes flickered down to his belt, where his gun was holstered. Was he going to arrest her, or worse? Just then, a familiar car pulled up to the curb. Maria's heart leapt in her chest. It was David, her husband, her protector. He had arrived. "Hey!" David's voice rang out, calm and commanding. "What's going on here? Why are you stopping my wife?" The officer turned sharply, his hand still on his radio. David's presence seemed to shift the energy in the air, but the officer wasn't ready to back down yet. She's being uncooperative, the officer snapped, glaring at Maria. She's refusing to follow my instructions and is obstructing justice. I'm not letting her go until she learns some respect. David's face hardened. His gaze flicked between the officer and Maria, then settled back on the officer, his voice icy with authority. My wife hasn't done anything wrong. She was simply walking home from work. Now you're harassing her for no reason. You have no grounds to detain her. The officer bristled, his eyes narrowing. You think you're going to tell me how to do my job? He barked. This is about respect, not your little lawyer act. She's disrespected me, and now she'll face the consequences. David stood his ground, his stance unwavering. You don't get to intimidate her. She's not the one being disrespectful here. You're the one abusing your power. His voice remained steady, but there was a sharp edge to it now. If you don't let her go right now, I'm filing a complaint. You'll regret this. The officer's jaw clenched. He didn't like being challenged, didn't like being shown up in front of another man. The tension was unbearable, the weight of the moment pressing down on all three of them. Maria stood frozen, her heart racing, watching as the officer hesitated. The seconds felt like an eternity. Would he back down? Would he listen to David? Or would this escalate into something far worse? The officer shifted his weight, but his hand didn't leave his radio. I'm not done here, he said, his voice low and threatening. David's gaze remained unflinching. You're done when I say you're done. Let my wife go, now. The officer hesitated for a long moment, his face reddening with frustration. The air was thick with tension. And then, slowly, as if reluctantly, he stepped back. You're lucky I'm letting you go this time, the officer muttered, his voice thick with anger. But don't think this is over. David didn't respond. He just stepped forward, gently placing his hand on Maria's shoulder. Come on, let's go, he said quietly. We're leaving. Maria didn't need any more encouragement. She let David lead her away, her body still trembling with the aftermath of the encounter. As they walked away from the officer, Maria felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The night had shifted, and though she was walking away with David, she knew this wouldn't be the last time she'd face something like this. But at least for tonight, they had won. David's hand remained on Maria's shoulder as he took a slow, deliberate step toward the officer. The weight of the moment hung in the air like a storm cloud, and Maria could feel her heartbeat in her throat. She was still shaken, her nerves raw, but having David there gave her a glimmer of hope. He would fix this. He always did. The officer shifted his weight, his posture defensive, but something in his eyes flickered as David approached. For the first time, the officer seemed less certain, and it was clear he realized that the situation had changed. Maria could feel it too. David's presence had shifted the balance of power in an instant. David stood tall, his expression calm, but his eyes were focused, sharp. He was a man who didn't back down from a fight, especially when it came to justice. And right now, that's exactly what he was fighting for. Officer, David said, his voice even but firm, I'd like you to explain to me why you're detaining my wife. The officer bristled at the question, his eyes narrowing. He clearly wasn't used to being questioned, especially by someone who appeared to be so composed in the face of his aggression. He shifted his stance, his fingers twitching slightly at his belt. I'm detaining her because she's suspicious, the officer muttered, his words clipped. She's out here alone, in this neighborhood, at this time of night. It's not right. I'm doing my job. David's eyes remained steady as he listened, his mind working quickly, analyzing the situation. He had heard enough. The officer's words were hollow, based on assumptions, stereotypes, and nothing more. His whole demeanor screamed that he was acting out of prejudice, not out of any legitimate concern for safety. Suspicious? David echoed, raising an eyebrow. Is that the extent of your reasoning? Let me remind you, officer, that suspicion alone is not a legal basis for detainment. My wife has done nothing wrong. She's walking home from work just like any other person would. What makes her suspicious in your eyes?" The officer took a step back, his eyes darting for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He wasn't ready to back down yet, not from this challenge. His hands twitched again and his posture stiffened. "She's out here alone. It's late. She doesn't belong here," he grumbled, his voice rising slightly in frustration. "I don't need to explain myself to you." David's gaze hardened, his jaw setting as his voice grew even firmer. "Actually, you do. As a law enforcement officer, you are obligated to provide a legitimate reason for stopping and detaining a person. You can't just decide someone's suspicious based on your own biases, and you certainly can't detain them without cause. Now, I'm asking you again to explain what crime my wife has committed." Maria, standing slightly behind David, could feel the tension rise as the officer's face flushed with irritation. She had never seen David so calm, so collected under pressure. His voice was like steel, unwavering, and the officer, despite his obvious discomfort, still tried to cling to his authority. "You're just trying to make this difficult," the officer spat, stepping closer to David now, his hand resting on his radio. "I'm not going to stand here and be lectured by some lawyer." David didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his voice unwavering. "I'm not lecturing you. I'm asking you to do your job correctly. If you're going to hold my wife here, then you need to provide a legitimate reason. You can't just make up reasons based on her race or the fact that she's walking alone. That's not how the law works. And I assure you, if you don't let her go right now, I'll be filing a formal complaint. You'll be held accountable for this." The officer's jaw clenched. He looked from David to Maria, then back to David, as if he were weighing his options. For a brief moment, the officer's expression faltered, and David could see the cracks beginning to form in his confidence. "You're not going to do that," the officer muttered, but his voice was less certain now. He took a step back, visibly shaken by the quiet confidence in David's words. You wouldn't make a fuss over this. She's just a—" David cut him off with a sharp, deliberate tone. "A black woman? Is that it? You're making judgments based on her appearance, on her skin color. And that, officer, is not just illegal, it's immoral. I won't let you get away with it. I will take this as far as I need to." The officer's face darkened, and his hand instinctively moved to his belt again. But this time, it wasn't as forceful, more out of habit than aggression. David could see the officer's hesitation, his struggle to maintain control, and it made the situation feel even more precarious. "You don't know what you're talking about," the officer growled, trying to regain his composure. "This isn't about race. This is about her being out of place." David didn't give an inch. "This is exactly about race, and you know it. Your actions are based on your prejudice, not on any reasonable grounds. And I'm not going to let you use your position to intimidate or harm my wife simply because she's walking home at night. I'll take this to the press. I'll take it to the department. I'll make sure your actions are scrutinized. You will face legal consequences if you don't let her go." The officer paused, his grip tightening on his radio. For a moment, he seemed to be considering David's words, his eyes flickering with doubt. The tension between them felt like a physical force, a standoff that neither man was willing to back down from. "I'm just doing my job," the officer muttered, but it sounded weaker now. The confidence he had walked into this confrontation with was crumbling, piece by piece. David's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Doing your job would mean you're following the law, officer. Right now, you're not. You're abusing your power, and you know it." There was a long, heavy silence. The officer's gaze flickered to the side, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. He knew David was right. He knew he had no legal standing to detain Maria. But his pride, his authority, and his prejudice were all warring inside him, and it was clear he wasn't ready to admit defeat. David took a step forward, his voice quieter now but no less commanding. "This is your last chance. Let my wife go or you will be facing serious consequences. I won't back down." The officer swallowed hard, his face reddening as his anger rose once more. But there was something different now, a crack in his facade. He didn't want to be the one to escalate this any further. And for the first time, David saw uncertainty in his eyes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer's shoulders slumped slightly. He wasn't ready to admit he was wrong, but he could see where this was heading. The pressure was too much. He looked at Maria for a long, tense moment before turning away. "Get out of here," the officer muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're lucky this time, but don't think this is over." David didn't respond. He turned to Maria, taking her hand gently in his. "Let's go home," he said quietly, his voice calm, but there was a fire in his eyes. As they walked away from the officer, Maria's legs felt like they were made of lead, but her heart felt lighter. The confrontation wasn't over in the grand sense. This was just one victory, but for tonight, they had won. And that felt like the first step toward something bigger, something that could make a real difference. As David and Maria stepped away from the officer, a heavy silence settled over them. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and their own footsteps on the sidewalk, the night air cold against their skin. Maria's pulse was still racing, her breath coming in shaky bursts, but a part of her felt the relief of having made it out of the confrontation alive. David, however, wasn't letting go of this so easily. His hand was firm around hers, his gaze steady ahead, but Maria could see the fire burning in his eyes. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. She glanced up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "David, that was terrifying. What if he had done something worse?" David squeezed her hand gently, his voice soft but resolute. "He didn't, because we didn't let him. But this isn't something we can just forget. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again." Maria nodded, her heart still heavy. "But we were lucky. He could have called for backup. He could have arrested me. What if I hadn't called you? What if you weren't here?" David's jaw clenched. "I'm always here for you, Maria. You're my wife. But we can't rely on luck. We can't let this kind of thing go unchallenged. No one deserves to be treated like that, especially not because of the color of their skin." Maria's heart swelled with gratitude for his strength, but at the same time, she couldn't help the weight of the fear that lingered. "But what now? What do we do?" David stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious but full of conviction. "We fight. We don't let this go. We're going to take action, and we're going to make sure that officer is held accountable for what he did." Maria felt a knot form in her stomach, a mix of worry and uncertainty. "David, do you really think we can win? He's an officer. What if we're just wasting our time?" David's gaze softened, his thumb brushing across her hand. "We're not wasting our time. We're standing up for what's right. And we're not alone in this. There are people who've been through the same thing, and there are laws that protect us. We'll fight this together, Maria." His words were a lifeline in the sea of fear and confusion that had washed over her. But still, a part of her wasn't sure what to expect, wasn't sure if they could win against the weight of an entire system that often seemed to protect people like that officer. "I'm scared, David," she admitted, her voice shaking. "What if nothing changes? What if we go through all of this, and the system just lets him go free?" David stepped closer, his hands gently cupping her face. "Then we keep fighting. We don't give up. This is bigger than us, Maria. It's bigger than that officer. It's about making sure people like him understand that they can't get away with this anymore. Not to you, not to anyone." She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. His words were comforting, but the reality of what they were about to face was daunting. Still, She knew David was right. She couldn't let fear keep her silent. She couldn't let this happen again, to her or anyone else. David took a step back, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling our attorney," he said, his tone already shifting back into professional mode. "We need to document everything. What happened, what was said, everything. I'll make sure we file a lawsuit for racial profiling and the violation of your rights. He's not just getting away with this." Maria nodded, her mind reeling. She hadn't expected any of this. She hadn't expected to be standing here, on the edge of taking legal action against a police officer. She had hoped, for the briefest of moments, that it would just be over, that they could go home and pretend like it hadn't happened. But now, the weight of the truth was sinking in. They couldn't just pretend. Not anymore. David's voice was calm as he spoke to their lawyer, going over the details of the incident, recounting everything in clear, concise language. Maria could hear the authority in David's words, the way he was laying the foundation for what was to come. And she knew, deep down, that they would take this as far as they needed to. They would fight this, not just for them, but for everyone who had ever faced the kind of injustice they had just witnessed. When David ended the call, he turned back to Maria, his face serious but filled with resolve. "Our lawyer's on board. We're going to gather all the evidence, all the footage, and we'll take this to court. We'll make sure that officer faces the consequences of his actions." Maria felt a weight lift off her shoulders, but the unease still lingered. "Do you really think they'll take us seriously?" she asked quietly. "What if we lose?" David smiled, a reassuring but determined smile. "We will take them seriously, and we will fight until the end. We have to, Maria. You deserve justice. And we're going to make sure you get it." Maria swallowed the lump in her throat, her mind now focused on the fight ahead. She could do this. With David by her side, she could do anything. Together, they would stand up for what was right. Together, they would face whatever came next. As they made their way back to their apartment, the weight of the day's events still hung heavily over them. But something else was growing inside Maria, a quiet, simmering strength that came from knowing she didn't have to face this alone. David had given her more than just protection. He had given her hope, and that was a gift she couldn't take for granted. The following days were filled with phone calls, paperwork, and meetings with their lawyer. David's legal knowledge proved invaluable, guiding them through each step of the process. Maria found herself reliving the moments with the officer, replaying the words, the gestures, the fear. But each time she spoke about it, she felt a little bit stronger, a little bit more determined. She wasn't just telling her story anymore, she was standing up to the system that had allowed it to happen in the first place. Then, one afternoon, they received a call from the police department. The officer who had detained Maria had been called in for questioning. The department had begun an internal investigation into his conduct, and the lawyer had confirmed that the case was going to be taken seriously. Maria couldn't believe it at first. She had hoped, but she hadn't truly expected this level of accountability. Yet here they were, on the path to making sure this officer was held responsible for his actions. David turned to Maria, his face filled with quiet pride. "We did this, Maria. We're making a difference. And we won't stop until we've changed things." Tears welled up in Maria's eyes as she hugged him tightly. In that moment, all of the fear, the anger, the uncertainty melted away. Together, they had made it through this dark moment. And no matter what happened next, they knew that they had taken a stand. Not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been unjustly treated. And that, in itself, was victory. The walk back home was long, and the city around them seemed to have quieted, the usual hum of activity now a soft background noise. The tension of the day had drained them both, their bodies heavy with exhaustion, but in the space between each step there was something else, something deeper, something that began to settle into their hearts. They had fought. They had stood up for each other, for their rights, and for justice. And though it hadn't been easy, they knew they had made a difference. They knew it wasn't the end, but a new beginning. Maria walked beside David, her hand wrapped around his, each step feeling like both a victory and a reminder of everything they had just endured. The weight of the injustice they had faced still hung heavy in the air, but with every passing minute, that weight felt a little lighter. They had confronted it, head-on, and survived, and as much as it had shaken them, it had also brought them closer. David, always the steady force, glanced over at her as they walked. The streetlights cast a soft glow on his face, but it was the expression in his eyes that Maria noticed, the same unwavering commitment she had seen earlier when he stood up to the officer. He wasn't just a lawyer fighting for her rights. He was her partner, her protector, her unwavering ally in a world that too often tried to pull people like her down. "Maria," David said, his voice quiet but strong, "I want you to know something. I know things aren't perfect. We both know that. This fight is far from over, and we're going to face more struggles along the way. But one thing I know for sure is this. We will always stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it gets." Maria didn't say anything at first, her mind still processing everything. She was still caught between the rush of adrenaline and the quiet, raw emotion of everything they had just experienced. But hearing David's words, hearing that commitment in his voice, gave her strength. He had always been her rock, and now, in this moment, he was more than that. He was the embodiment of resilience. "I know," Maria finally said, her voice soft, yet filled with a quiet determination. "I know we can't change everything overnight. I know the world is still full of injustice, still full of hate. But if we don't stand up, if we don't fight, then who will? We can't just sit by and let it happen again. We can't let people like that officer continue to get away with it." David nodded, his face serious but filled with a quiet hope. "Exactly. We have to keep fighting for what's right, for every person who's ever been treated unfairly, for every voice that's been silenced. We don't have the power to fix everything, but we have the power to make a difference, one step at a time. And together, Maria, we can do anything." They continued walking, their pace steady but reflective, as the city around them slowly returned to its rhythm. The hum of the world, the noise of the crowd, had a different tone now. It was quieter somehow, more distant, but it wasn't a silence of defeat. It was a silence of solidarity. They weren't alone. They weren't the only ones standing up, fighting back, pushing for change. There were others, all over the world, doing the same thing. And together, they would make their voices heard. As they walked further down the street, they reached the corner where their apartment building stood. The familiar sight of their home was a welcome one, but even in its comfort, there was a lingering sense of something more. It wasn't just a place to sleep at night anymore. It had become a symbol of the fight they were part of the changes they would bring, no matter how long it took. Maria stopped for a moment and looked up at the stars that were beginning to show in the sky, the city lights flickering in the distance. She took a deep breath, allowing the cool night air to fill her lungs. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift, waiting for change. David stopped beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He followed her gaze up to the stars, and for a moment they stood in silence, letting the night embrace them. "You know," Maria said quietly, "I used to think that change was something big, something you could only see when the world shifted all at once. But now I see it differently. Change is made up of small moments, small decisions to stand up, to speak out, to fight. Maybe it's not always perfect, but it's something. It's a start." David smiled softly, his eyes warm. "Exactly. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with us. It starts with the people who refuse to be silent. It starts with you, with me, with every person who's ever faced injustice and said, enough. We're not just waiting for someone else to fix it. We're making that change, one step at a time. Maria felt her heart swell with something close to peace. She had always believed in justice, in standing up for what was right, but this experience had solidified that belief in a way she had never expected. She wasn't just a bystander in the world, she was part of a larger movement. And every step she took, every choice she made, was part of a story that could change the future. As they reached their front door, David turned to her, his expression soft but filled with resolve. "We've made it this far, Maria, and we're going to keep going. Whatever happens, we'll keep fighting. Because we know that even when the world tries to pull you down, you can rise. Together we can change the future." Maria smiled, feeling the weight of his words settle into her bones. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a better world, a world where justice and equality weren't just ideals, but reality. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she knew that with David by her side, she would never have to face it alone. Hand in hand, they stepped into their apartment, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that as long as they had each other, they had everything they needed to keep fighting, to keep rising, and to keep pushing for a world where everyone could live with dignity and respect. And in the quiet of their home, as they shared a quiet moment together, the message was clear. The fight wasn't over, but they were ready. Together they could change the world. Together they could rise.